Hello everyone and welcome. This is the video for the 4.04 lesson from War to Peace. And this is when we're entering one of my personal favorite times in US history, the 1950s. The war was over and Americans were ready to enjoy the fruits of peace. As it turned out, an unprecedented period of economic growth restored a spirit of confidence and transformed the United States into the world's most affluent society. But even in the midst of prosperity, there were new social pressures and problems. While television and movies have sometimes perpetuated an image of the 50s being happy days, the reality of the American experience was far more complex. Goals for this lesson: recognize the causes and results of the post-war economic boom, describe major trends in American society and the post-war era and the reasons for them, and analyze the influence of technology on everyday life in the 1950s. Grab your lesson resources. You need your reading guide, lesson answer key, and also this other sheet, Levittowns. And move on, we're going to read pages 772 through 783. So let's get to our textbook, and we see the first page is of the chapter of this wonderful little 1950s family watching this wonderful thing called the television. And the name of this title, or this chapter, is Society and Culture in the Post-War Era. August 14, 1945. Across the nation, people celebrated the news that World War II was finally over. Nazi Germany was defeated. Japan's militarists had surrendered. Americans had emerged victorious from their hardest trial since the Civil War. The war's end brought great joy, but also new worries. Now the GI generation, the greatest generation since the founders, some would say, face urgent challenges. Where would millions of veterans find work? How would the economy thrive without heavy military spending? Many economists feared another depression. Emerging from the harrowing experiences of war, Americans were ready to enjoy the fruits of peace. As it turned out, an unprecedented period of economic growth restored a spirit of confidence and transformed the nation into the world's most affluent society. Even in the midst of prosperity, however, there were new social pressures and problems. While television and movies have sometimes perpetuated an image of the 1950s as the happy days, the reality of the American experience in the decade was far more complex. The post-war economy. Just after the end of World War II, the American economy entered a brief period of turbulence. Veterans faced a housing shortage. Newspapers reported that veterans were living in temporary shelters in American cities. When the government lifted wartime price controls on consumer goods, prices shot up. Many Americans found their paychecks could not keep up with rising inflation. Union workers in industries from autos to oils to textiles walked off the job to picket for higher wages, provoking anger from veterans who resented workers who had stayed on the home front. These post-war economic troubles proved brief, but they did not drag the economy into another depression. On the contrary, the American economy bounced back to new heights. Reasons for prosperity. Several factors contributed to the nation's post-war prosperity. While the war had ravaged many industrialized nations, including England, France, the Soviet Union, Germany, and Japan, the United States was spared any great devastation. With factories up and running, American manufacturers enjoyed a boom in international trade. After the war, consumers were ready to buy, buy, buy. During the war, wartime rationing had made it all but impossible to buy non-essential consumer items, so people saved their earnings, often by purchasing the government's war bonds. With the war over, they were ready to spend their savings on cars, houses, new appliances, and many creature comforts. Because factories could not shift instantly from making bombs and bullets to making automobiles and nylon stockings, Americans initially faced frustrating shortages of the things they wanted most. But once the factories caught up with demand, spending shot up and the economy thrived as Americans poured their hard-earned dollars into it. Although the government was no longer spending money on wartime programs, it continued to invest in both military and business efforts to strengthen America in the Cold War. Government funding helped support new research and manufacturing efforts in aviation, space exploration, and electronic innovation such as the new computer industry. Let's look at the picture here on the right. Truman called the American GI's homecoming the most remarkable demobilization of the history of the world. Pictures of them coming home there on the train. The GI Bill. With the end of World War II, 12 million GIs were on their way home, eager to resume normal lives. Within 2 years, the number of American Armed Forces personnel decreased from 12 million to 1.5 million. How would the nation accommodate what President Truman called the most remarkable demobilization in the history of the world? Fortunately, the government officials had anticipated these challenges. In 1944, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights, or GI Bill for short. It was a landmark piece of legislation that changed the social and physical landscape of the country. Among its many provisions, the new law provided generous living stipends and unemployment insurance to help veterans get back on their feet. It offered loans to help them start small businesses. Perhaps most important, the GI Bill helped returning servicemen purchase new homes. The GI Bill included the biggest boost to education ever. It gave veterans money to enroll in universities and colleges. Millions of war veterans enjoyed upward mobility. College degrees enabled them to leave their blue-collar origins to start white-collar careers in business and the professions. Universities expanded to meet the demand. In the late 1940s, millions of veterans took advantage of the benefits of the GI Bill. They swelled the ranks of American colleges and bought new houses in the suburbs. The GI Bill vastly expanded the ranks of the post-war middle class. It also helped transform Americans' perceptions of higher education. A college degree long reserved for a privileged few became a basic expectation for the children of the expanding middle class. And when you see this graph here of the growing affluent society, and see how it changed from the 40s to the 50s and then on to the 60s. The rising standard of living. A British historian who toured the United States in the winter of 1948-49 went home awestruck. There never was a country more fabulous than America, he declared. Half the wealth of the world, more than half the productivity, nearly 2/3 of the world's machines are concentrated in Americans' hands. The biggest economic boom in history was underway. By the late 1950s, the United States led the world in per capita income by a wide margin. Living standards lagged among some groups. Many rural whites faced poverty in the midst of abundance. Some minorities, especially African Americans and Mexican Americans, did not share equally in the general affluence. Although African Americans in 1950 were earning significantly more than they had in 1940, there is still a wide gap between the average annual income of whites and blacks, a gap that widened over the course of the 1950s. Despite these inequities, the overall average standard of living rose dramatically in the post-war United States. Now let's read this excerpt here. Rural poverty. Prosperity of the 50s did not reach many rural areas. Many small family farmers were put out of business by large corporations that mechanized agriculture into big business. In the South, workers on cotton fields lost jobs when new synthetic fibers such as polyester reduced the demand for cotton. In the West, American and Asian American migrant workers continued to eke out a marginal existence. In the rural region known as Appalachia that stretched along the Appalachian Mountains, a decline in the coal industry impoverished many families. In all, about 1/5 of the nation's population lived in poverty in the 1950s. New benefits for labor. Oh, let's look here on the left too, or the right before we continue on. After the war, returning veterans contributed to a national surge in population growth, a veritable baby boom. And we see a hospital nursery there in the photo with many, many babies. New benefits for labor. Though organized labor suffered a setback with the restriction imposed by the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, labor's growing strength and numbers helped even the playing field. In the 1940s, major industrial employers agreed to grant their workers such benefits as paid vacations, health insurance, and retirement pensions. In 1948, Walter Reuther, head of the United Auto Workers, negotiated an agreement with General Motors in which GM agreed to provide annual cost of living adjustments, COLAs, to help wages keep pace with inflation. These changes transformed the lives of millions of American families. Unionized blue-collar workers now found themselves comfortably secure and relatively prosperous. It became increasingly difficult to distinguish between the working class and the middle class. According to Fortune magazine, by 1954, the typical middle-class consumer was no longer a small-town landlord or drugstore proprietor. If any stereotype is at all meaningful, it might be the machinist in Detroit. The baby boom. With millions of veterans returning home and eager to start families, the nation experienced a dramatic post-war surge in population growth, a baby boom. Baby boomer parents included older couples who had postponed marriage and children during the Great Depression and Second World War because it had seemed unwise to start a family in those uncertain times. But in the post-war expanding economy, these couples, along with younger people who married during or shortly after the war, felt increasingly confident about their chances in life. Between 1945 and 1960, the population of the United States increased by almost 30%. During these years, the U.S. population grew by almost 40 million, and the baby boom stretched into the 1960s. The sheer number of baby boom children made them a force that would alter every part of American life, from politics to fashion to the landscape itself. All these new children fueled a growing economy. The construction industry boomed in response to the demand for new homes. As young families moved into these homes, they bought appliances, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and more. The little ones needed clothes and diapers. In 1957, diaper manufacturers took in 50 million. As the kids grew up, they demanded toys, hula hoops, roller skates, Barbie dolls, Davy Crockett coonskin caps, TV character lunchboxes, silly putty, and Super Balls. As the children grew older, cities and towns had to build more schools. In the late 1950s and early 60s, the taste of tens of millions of boomer teens would transform American culture. Oh God, I love this. It's so exciting, isn't it? And here's a picture of the infamous hula hoop. And here is a graph showing the baby boom. Look at there, 1940, and then shoots up to the 50s and doesn't start falling until after 1960. Permissive parenting? In the 1950s, many baby boomer parents turned to advice about child rearing into a book first published in 1946, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, by a pediatrician named Benjamin Spock. Spock reassured anxious new mothers, "You know more than you think you do." He rejected the stern advice commonly given to mothers during the 20s and 30s, which included keeping babies on a rigid feeding schedule and avoiding hugging and kissing children. Spock advised parents to respect their children as distinct individuals. In the place of rigid rules, he advised flexibility and common sense. For example, if little Johnny steals someone else's toy, do not spank or punish him, but explain that stealing is wrong. Some critics charge that Spock's child-centered model of parenting encouraged a permissiveness that would turn the baby boomers into a generation of spoiled self-seekers. After its initial publication, Spock's book would go on to sell 22 million copies over the next quarter century. It was enormously influential in shaping the views of millions of middle-class families. Suburban dreams. Baby carriages set young couples to dreaming of a house and a yard outside the city. With wages rising and Washington giving housing loans to veterans, many could afford the cost. The early 1900s had seen the U.S. population shift from farms and small towns to cities. Now at mid-century, another shift occurred with the dramatic expansion of the suburbs. Builders such as William Levitt spotted a huge new market and moved to supply it. Levitt supplied the techniques of mass production to home building. American know-how had built thousands of B-17 and B-29 bombers and Liberty ships, so why not houses? On former potato fields near Hempstead, Long Island, Levitt's crews erected 17,000 homes, each with a 60 by 100 foot lot, fresh sod, and a couple of trees, the first of several Levitt towns that went up across the country. The new suburban communities accounted for a massive increase in single-family homes. In 1940, only 1 in every 5 Americans lived in a suburb. By 1960, the figure rose to 1 in 3. The population has shifted to a world of new houses, new shopping centers, and new schools. As suburbs flourished, old ethnic neighborhoods in the cities began to fragment. New suburban developments were almost exclusively white. Banks often refused to grant mortgages to African American homebuyers. In Levittown, the buyer's contract ruled out members other than the Caucasian race. A pattern of racial segregation emerged. Whites in the suburbs, black and other minorities in the cities. It was a divide that would soon ignite a crisis of urban poverty and unrest. Critics worried the suburbs would lead to a look-alike, think-alike nation. The songwriter Melvina Reynolds looked at the suburbs and saw little boxes made of ticky-tacky, and they all looked just the same, just like this picture here. But to people who are growing up in the hard times of the 30s, a modest suburban house, even if it's a cookie-cutter look-alike, was far preferable to a cramped city tenement or a destitute farm. Cozy living rooms, modern kitchens with electric dishwashers, and grassy yards seemed a welcome reward for the generation that had fought and won the good war against global fascism. For many families in the post-war era, such domestic pleasures defined the American dream. And we'll stop this video here and start up with the next one.